My name is Tarik. Welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel.
Go back to 2016 and two of the best North American players were Stewie and Tarik. Stewie was the in-game leader and best player of Cloud9 for most of that year, arguably the best NA player at the time. NAF didn't really level up until the following year. Elysia's prime didn't come until Cologne onwards, so second half of the year. Skadoodle was falling off, JDM wasn't as good anymore. Then you go and look, Tarik was a strong carry player in CLG. He was part of the reason why they managed to get that one top 8 at MLG Columbus that everyone forgets about because they lost to Simple and Team Liquid. And Team Liquid carried kind of the American flag to the next round of the tournament. Then, though, people forget he went after that to Optic Gaming, of course, turned them into champions. At one point in time, it was actually rumoured, in fact, of one of their first tournaments where they didn't have Stanislaw, Tarik was going to be the in-game leader because he was doing that kind of a role at the time. You come to 2017, they're both in Cloud9. That was a very balanced squad, I thought, actually. Like, for my money, Automatic probably the best player overall. But after that, Tarik and Stewie, certainly strong players and fraggers in their own right. And then Rush and Skadoodle, somewhat consigned to being role players. In the case of Skadoodle, just a bad AWPer, wasn't he? So then, obviously, they won the major together early 2018. For my money, if you have to pick a Cloud9 player as the MVP, it should be Tarik for the whole tournament. If it doesn't have to be a Cloud9 player, I personally thought Guardian was the best player overall in the tournament and the most valuable, almost won his team the major. Then you had Stewie, obviously went to SK Gaming, who later became MIBR. That happened at the end of March. Then Tarik followed in mid-July, so, a few more months after that. In the team MIBR, they were clearly role-swapped. Like, no longer were these star players, no longer were these players built around, no longer were these the players that defined the way their team played. They were instead forced into auxiliary roles so that the big names of Fur, Fall and Cold Zero, the guys who always had everything they wanted in their team, they got to have the roles they wanted, the spots they wanted, to play the maps the way they wanted to. And you know what? They were the established players. They were the major winners. They won more majors than these guys did. And so they were at the top of the pecking order. So interestingly, though, the roles that these players then adopted became quite key for later in their careers. Because think about it, when they were role swapped, they essentially became support players or entries, depending on what the map was and which half it was. In terms of comms, they clearly had their issues. They couldn't speak Portuguese and the team had to speak in English. But even then, I'll add in this, the cultural issue, in my opinion, is bigger. Like, I've heard the comms of teams that these guys have played in. They're not very in-depth in terms of communication. There's a lot of signal noise. I don't know if Portuguese or Brazilian players like that. I don't know if they can handle that if he's speaking in English at that kind of a rapid pace, saying the same thing 4 or 5 times. So I actually thought some of those aspects were overblown. And I actually personally think it probably put off the Brazilian players from ever playing in an international squad again in a way that was probably too hasty, actually. I think if they'd had a guy from Norway or Denmark or something, and then he's speaking in English, I don't think he would have the same kind of comms, the same kind of signal noise, quite frankly. So the problem with this MIBR squad is it was much more of a step up from the team they'd been earlier in the year when they were essentially irrelevant in most big tournaments. But it wasn't good enough overall. They weren't a true contender in the world. They had some nice runs. They had the top 4 at the major when they had a weaker side of the bracket. They made it to second place at Blast Istanbul, but that was the one where all the top teams except Astralis were over at ESL New York. They had a second at ECS Season 6, which was pretty legit. Obviously, second place to Astralis. Yeah, that's a good result. They had a top 4 EPL Season 8, another nice performance. But aside from that, it was a bunch of whatever performances. They had tournaments where they didn't do that well. And then by the end of the year, the experiment was basically over. Stewie obviously went to Team Liquid. So when Stewie went to Team Liquid, they immediately beat Astralis right out the gate. Quickly enough, he turned out to be a key change for him as a squad. He became an entry threat that really opened up the game as some of the other players behind him who just had to be follow-ups. I would say Elige actually took another step up in terms of consistency with someone like Stewie to go ahead of him. I think it marked a more aggressive and decisive Team Liquid squad as opposed to what I would have called an NA bastardized pseudo-Astralis style that they ran in 2018, which on the one hand could be more satisfying if you enjoy tactical Counter-Strike, but I don't think it ever had the fire and the force of the 2019 Team Liquid, and I think that's represented in the success that 2019 Team Liquid had. I mean, they almost had an era, they had an incredible amount of success. Meanwhile, you had Tarik go over to NRG, later to become EG. They were top 4 in EG, NRG rather, seemingly every event. Then they brought in Stanislaw, they made top 4 at the major, they won ESL New York and Star Series, they were at one point in time number 2 ranked team in the whole world. But again, he wasn't doing as a carry play in the same way as Stewie was just the hard entry of Team Liquid. but he's doing it as a support, as a kind of a fill player, filling in the areas, because aside from Stanislaw, nobody's that experienced in his team. Like Breeze has never been in a top team until NRG. Obviously, Cirque was just playing over in Europe, and this was his first team to kind of get leveled up. And Ethan, he was back with Tarik back in CLG when he was just a young pup. So in this case, whereas it was like the voice, the aggression, the willingness to run through a brick wall that put Stewie into a successful position in Team Liquid being the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, in NRG/EG, I think actually Tarik, by the time the Stanislaw lineup came along, was playing almost like a full support. And as I say, for a fill player, like he's taking spots people don't want on maps. In terms of comms, he's being a key voice. And he's being the rare veteran experience. Stanislaw hasn't been that kind of an outgoing, charismatic leader. So I think actually it was the captaincy for me was with Tarik within that squad. In the same way as you could make the case in Team Liquid, Stewie's playing that role to some degree. So what I find cool about this is the roles that they role swap to play in MIBR, somewhat through happenstance and being forced to, if they want to be in that squad, they've then been able to basically successfully embrace and make themselves key elements within elite squads, top 2 squads in the world, squads beating Astralis, winning massive tournaments. So this is a big time accomplishment for NA players. So what I like is that they not only were willing to embrace new roles to make the teams better, but they used their experience. They were able to motivate their teammates. They were able to even band-aid either other players who were having difficulties or make the team's style work. I mean, you saw it went to its extreme by the end of the year, but Stewie basically would add in some relentless aggression when the rest of the Team Liquid players were starting to put their foot off the gas pedal and were starting to go a bit slower. That's what would hypercharge them up. And most famously, the ESL Season 9 Pro League quarterfinals against Astralis, I mean, he was key on that Vertigo game to getting them the win. I think if you go over to Tarik, like I say, his experience has been able to cover inexperience with some of the other players. I think it's been able to make players like Cirque more comfortable. Someone like Ethan doesn't seem to have had as many positions that were tricky for him to play. I think this is very interesting stuff when you see the primes of where these players have been at in their careers so far. So the most interesting part is what they tried to do in MIBR but couldn't make work. Maybe they hadn't tried the roles for long enough, or they were just playing with players that they weren't experienced enough to play with, or they had the cultural or communication clash. Later, brought them into what became elite squads that they helped elevate through this play, being role swapped and helping to make the other players the stars. Because I've often had big respect for people who themselves have been the star at one point in their career, then they find success comparable or even better later by role swapping and being the supportive element. I mean, classic names from 1.6 would be Khan and DSN did this in a way that actually Heaton and Potty never attempted to in their careers. Once they were finished being stars, they were just finished winning, or it was the end of their careers. Khan and DSN reinvented themselves in 2009 onwards and were able to have arguably more success as kind of the support/fill players in that regard. Neo and Taz in CSGO in Virtus Pro, they were the stars in 1.6. In CSGO, they were the guys setting up Snacks, Bialy, making sure Pasha was able to play that very unorthodox style with weird movement and taking crazy shots, but that somehow would work. Quite frankly, again, to contrast them against some Swedish greats, Forrest and GetRight have never successfully done this for my money in CSGO. If they had, say 2 years ago, if GetRight had made being a support work, which I never thought he quite did, although his utility was decent, and Forrest had ever been just an entry, I think actually they could have brought in the next generation of Swedish players and they never would have needed to leave NIP. They could have brought the team back to the top, but they were never quite willing to. Forrest instead has stayed in some of his starring roles, and as a result, he's not a top player in the world, so they could never go that far in terms of their peak. GetRight could never be a good enough supportive element for my money to ever make the squad work in that respect. I mean, even in Dig now, he looks better when he's in more of a starring role and he does most of his damage from the CT side as far as I can tell. So it's actually cannot be taken for granted that it's easy to do this or like anyone can role swap in this way. These kinds of role swaps, you notice, take a commitment as well. You have to be willing to put in maybe a year and a half, 2 years before you ever get the results that you were really hoping for. You're not just going to switch and overnight be that amazing at that kind of a role. I'd say a lot of the great sport players didn't do that. It took them some time to build up to it as well. So I think we're getting to a point now where when you see the impact these players have had, you can now start to compare them to Zipniks, NBK, some of the players who've been able to play these roles and quite frankly impress us from a totally different style or focal point within their teams. Even when Stewie was the entry in the star in Cloud9, he could shot call the whole game around himself. He was the IGL, so he could set himself up to be a superstar player or play off his reads. Now he's having to do the same within someone else's system. Tarik, when he in the past has been just a player within teams like Optic, he was still one of the big fraggers. He was even AWP at times. So I'm impressed that these players have embraced it. And quite frankly, their mindsets, you notice none of those players I listed off there were NA players. This is a very unique career pivot for an NA player, and it's why these are still relevant players in top teams, whereas if they were playing as stars, I don't know if certainly not if both of them would be in the top teams right now. Maybe they would have been recycled back to some of the lesser squads. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Bobby, Dean Tanglis, Istar, JDubs, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, Soliko, Spencer Green, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my main man Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in those AMAs I do each month. Do you want teasers for who's going to appear next on my content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy discussions about esports with me. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.